Hello, you lovely lot, and Happy New Year. I think I can still say that on the 13th of January when I'm recording this. If you're listening to this in, I don't know, July, happy summer. I suppose if you're listening to it at the end of this year and getting ready for Christmas, oh, hope you have a nice Christmas, but you should be listening to this in January. So, we ended last year with a cracking interview with the brilliant Dr. Eleanor Yaniger, and I thought, why not start the year with something else that was a little bit different? And I am absolutely overjoyed to be joined by the wonderful Cat Irving. Now, if you haven't heard of Cat, she works as a human remains conservator, which we're going to be talking about. And apparently she's been doing that for a quarter of a century, which
Yep.
is a long time. She's currently working on a book due out in spring 2028 called Conversations with the Dead. She's been a consultant on TV stuff. She's appeared on TV stuff. She's a regular on History Hit, and other podcasts, not just Haunted Histories. You sound like a busy lass, Kat.
Yeah, occasionally I sleep and things like that. But generally it's difficult to shut me up about this stuff. So, I'm always happy to talk to people
Awesome.
about what I do and this amazing subject.
So, how did you actually get in? How does one become, and what is a human remains conservator? I don't even know. Is it conservator, conservator?
Conservator.
Conservator.
I always think it'd be one of those things that, you should go for the gendering of it, and I should be a human remains conservatrix because that sounds quite cool. But human
Mm.
remains conservator is my job title.
Ah,
But what that is that I am somebody who stops decomposition happening.
right.
That's what the body wants to do when you die.
Hmm.
It's nature's recycling. It's how you get everything, back into the world, back into the system, so it can get reused by, other people or plants or animals or all that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But sometimes we don't want decomposition to happen, and from my point of view, most of the remains that I work with are from medical collections. So
Hmm.
these would be used to teach medical students, to show other doctors,
Hmm.
um, to try and inform people about the body and about how it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And this was really, really, really important because, in an age, particularly a lot of what I work with is remains from the 18th and the 19th century.
Hmm.
So this was a point when you couldn't just snap something with a camera if you wanted to teach people about it. You could make artworks, but that was time consuming, expensive, required more talent than I've got. And it's not quite the same. A drawing, an illustration of anatomy is a map, but it's not the same as actually working with the squidgy reality of our insides. So
Hmm.
by preserving these remains, it was one of the best ways that you could teach people. And
Right.
by the time you get into the 19th century, it was said that you had to have a museum to teach medicine and anatomy. So
Hmm.
that's how collections like the one that I work with here at Surgeons Hall, the one that I work with at the Hunterian Museum Glasgow, how they develop. But you need somebody who's going to maintain that, to keep those medical preparations spick and span, so
Yeah.
that decomposition doesn't start to creep in. And so that's what my job is. I'm trying to maintain uh, parts of the body, bones, in their best so that they can be still used and appreciated by future generations. So that's what I do. That's what my job is.
Right.
How I got here, that's a really interesting story. I'm an anatomist by background.
Right.
So, that's what I did for my undergraduate. I used to dissect donated human bodies
Okay.
as part of my undergrad, worked with preserved human material like I deal with today. Um, and that's what I did. That's what I love doing. I was one of those kids that I would take my dog for a walk as a child and I would find dead animals and I would take them home and I would cut them up. I love anatomy. And I also love the idea of anatomy museums. I went
Hmm.
to Edinburgh University. We had an amazing anatomy museum there where we used to have tutorials and things like that. There was also an amazing bone room at the National Museum of Scotland where I would go and spend time between lectures. And so I had this really I thought that would be the best thing that you could do, like
Mm.
to work. So while I was still doing my undergrad, I wrote to all the places in Scotland which had collections like this, and just went, "Can I come and work for you? Please, 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 please. I'll do anything." And I always like to point out that Surgeons Hall never replied. Um,
Rude, rude.
yeah, but the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow did, and they were very, very keen. They were actually looking for someone at that point. They didn't have anyone specifically working with their human remains collection, which is an amazing 18th century collection. And so I came along and they were very, very pleased. We had an amazing discussion. And then I didn't hear from them again. And I was just like, oh, well, that's that.
Mm.
And I left university. I got a job in the city mortuary. So
Hmm.
I was removing people's brains. I was opening up the body, taking the organs out, preparing them for the pathologist, then putting everything back together and, making the body ready to go back to the families after the autopsy.
Hmm.
And I did that for about a year. And then all of a sudden, I got an email from the Hunterian Museum going, "We've just got a grant. Are you still interested in doing that?" And the grant paid for me to learn what I needed to do this job
Yeah.
and to actually do it. So that was my start. And as you said,
Wow.
that's a quarter of a century ago now. So I've been doing it for a long time, and I came to Surgeons Hall in 2015. So I've been here a while now.
Wow. Wow. I mean, I love the way you're talking about, yeah, I'm just taking their brains out, taking the bits, internal bits out ready. Did you do it then because you had like an interest in would you have taken it on a medical route if the museum jobs hadn't?
Yeah, my husband always laughs when people ask about whether or not why didn't I go into medicine? And I
Mm,
am terrible with ill people. I would never have been a good doctor. So going down that road, to be a pathologist, you need to have done a medical degree first.
right.
I wouldn't have been good at that. So it was always working with the dead that I wanted to do. And
Mm,
the mortuary work was a fabulous experience. Not so much from the point of view of the living people that I was
mm,
working with, because largely they weren't good. But the actual work with the dead was very, very satisfying, very
mm,
rewarding. It's a thing I say a lot, but it's always such a privilege to actually be able to work with people's dead bodies.
mm. I used to know someone, he was a funeral director, and he was also one of the ones that would do all the embalming and everything else. And he actually said the same thing. He always found it a real honor that he got to
Yes.
look after that body.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm personally not religious, so the whole final journey thing, I don't see it from a religious perspective. But the next stage, the sort of, the body is probably at the most vulnerable it can be, and you are the
Yeah.
one
Yeah,
caring
and
for it.
it's a duty of care, and
Yeah.
it's still, the remains that I work with now are a lot older, largely than than the remains that I worked with at the mortuary,
Mm,
but it's still that feeling like you're caring for someone.
mm. Yeah. So, is it true that a body smells when you're opening it up?
When if you're dissecting, you know, a fresh body.
Mm,
So the kind of bodies that I would deal with at the mortuary,
hmm.
um, there's a very meaty smell, that
Right.
kind of, like a butcher's effectively. And then, of course, you have intestines
Hmm.
and intestines of things that, usually go down the toilet in them. So if
Hmm.
you get to that, you get that kind of smell,
Okay. Okay.
So, um, uh, and then if the body is not so fresh, if it was somebody who maybe wasn't discovered straight away,
So there's a bit of
then
decomposition going on
there's a bit of
already. Yeah.
decomposition going on. Things are starting to get a bit stinky. Then you start to get a smell.
Okay.
But there's a whole array of odors. But of course, the remains that I work with now, and like the ones that I dissected when I was at university, have some element of preservation going on. So
Right.
largely the smell you get is what has been used to preserve them.
Ah. So, for example, I read one of your blogs and it was about a tongue that had shown tongue cancer and you had to
Mm,
represerve it. I think you wrote it a couple of years ago. And the jar that it had been in was leaking. So there was mold growing
yes.
on the tongue. Um, and there's me sort of looking at the picture like this, sort of, you can't see it because this is all audio, but if you were watching me on camera, you'd see me turning sideways now because I'm trying to imagine the tongue, sort of where the back of the throat would have been, where
Mhm.
the cancerous stuff was. So, when you're taking that out, treating the mold that had grown. A fascinating article, by the way, if anyone go onto the college website, and there's all these amazing blogs on there from a variety of different people. I mean, I was reading one about some women getting scalped basically during the Industrial Revolution,
Mm.
as well as others. Um, I'm presuming then when you sort of you empty the stuff out, you clean up the tongue, and then you're putting the preservation fluids back in. That doesn't smell. It literally, or does it smell because it's gone a bit moldy, if you
You
get what I mean?
sometimes let less with things that when you get that kind of mold in a fluid preserved things, sometimes you'll get bones with a bit of mold on it, and you will get
Really?
that kind of moldy smell from
Wow.
that. Um, but usually if it's something that's fluid preserved, what you're getting is the smell of whatever the fluid
Right.
is.
So,
Um,
so what's your favorite bit of body that you've had to preserve? This is fascinating.
I love the gallbladder because it's
Really?
such a pretty color.
Okay. Why, what
Yeah, and
color
there's
is it?
also
What color is it?
it's a sort of a green color. It's so that's
Okay.
really really nice. But I absolutely love the lymphatic system.
Okay.
Yeah,
Why?
and a
Why?
lot of people don't
Why?
even know what the lymphatic system is. It's one of the things I'm really, really grateful to the recent Guillermo del Toro Frankenstein film
Right.
because they mention the lymphatic system a lot, and it's just like you don't expect that in a mainstream movie.
Okay.
Um, but the lymphatic system is this thing that, largely you can't see it very
Hmm.
well. And the way they start to make that visible to the eye was by injecting it with mercury. And so you get
Okay.
these amazing preparations of tissue with these very fine injections of mercury sort of like spreading through them, and they are so beautiful. You've got to imagine they look like jewelry, like a
Really?
fabric with just very, very fine silver threads going through it, and they are so, so glorious. Really, really difficult and dangerous to work with, but very, very, very beautiful.
The amount I know about, I know that normally if people have cancer, they have loads of lymph nodes removed because the lymphatic system covers the whole body and anything that's in your body is going to go through it. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. The lymphatic system is it's part of it's sort of a waste drainage
Mm.
system and filtration system, but it's part of your immune system. So as it's draining the waste, they all have to go through these lymph nodes where there's accumulations of white blood cells which will get rid of anything you shouldn't have. But of course, because it goes through your body, that allows cancer to
Mm.
metastasize through the lymphatic system quite easily, which of course is not great.
So it's basically the sewage system for the body.
Yeah, yeah, it really is.
Hmm.
But it can look so pretty.
Okay.
As if you go to somewhere like London or Paris, some of those Victorian sewers can look really, really beautiful as well.
Oh,
Um,
I think they're fascinating. I think they're
yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely
So again,
fascinating.
just because it's a sewage system doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't appreciate it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay. So on that note, talking anatomy,
Mhm.
one of the things I wanted to bring up, which because it's synonymous with Edinburgh. I mean, there's a few things that are synonymous with Edinburgh, but this is definitely one of them. And it's one of the ones that when people call them body snatchers, I jump up and down and go, they were murderers. They weren't body
Yeah,
snatchers. You know exactly who I'm
yeah.
talking about on that, don't you?
I
Burke
do
and
know
Hare.
exactly who you're talking
Burke
about.
and Hare. And
Yeah.
people say I'm being a bit anal. I'm being a bit sort of
No,
OCD
no, no,
like,
no,
but
no.
they never
Absolutely not.
snatch. Now, because I know you all know this, but for the listeners, body snatching, technically speaking, wasn't actually that illegal because the
No,
body
no, it
has no
wasn't.
owner. So therefore, the resurrectionists, as they were called, and I know I've kind of jumped forward a bit here, so as long as they didn't nick the clothes or the jewelry or anything like that that was in the grave, it was literally a slap on the wrists for doing
Yeah, I
what
mean,
they were doing.
if you took the clothing, that's theft, and you could
Yeah,
get hanged for
grave
that.
robbing, grave robbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're taking the body because it's got no owner,
Hmm.
then again, that's not theft. So what you could get done for at that point is disturbing a grave.
Mm. More
And
more
that
moral crime as opposed to
yeah,
actual physical,
it's a
right?
misdemeanor. It's
Yeah.
not, it's not going to cause the same legal problems as the theft is, but it will cause moral outrage,
Yeah.
fairly understandably.
Yeah. So, and a lot of people lump Burke and Hare in with the grave robbers, the resurrectionists, which they are not. Burke and Hare were murderers who sold the murdered victim to, was it Robert Knox? So it's
Robert
Robert
Knox.
Knox. And this was all happening in Edinburgh. And one of the
Yes.
reasons there was so much of this in Edinburgh is Edinburgh was one of the leading medical anatomy schools, for want of a better
Yeah.
term. Now, I think Burke and Hare get enough talked about because at the end of the day, they were killers. They were killers, but it was
Yeah.
the misconception as to what they did, which I find
Yeah.
fascinating. And also how much actually the role of true resurrectionists was needed because of the up until that, well, up until we're going to talk about the Anatomy Act in a second of 1832, up until that point, bodies could not be donated to science, could
Bodies,
they?
yeah, well, I mean, bodies couldn't really be donated after the 1832 Anatomy Act. But before the 1832 Anatomy Act, medical schools could only get bodies through a legal method by what was known as the 1752 Murder Act.
Hmm.
Now, what the Murder Act said, the proper name for it was an act for better preventing the horrible crime of murder.
Hmm.
And this was the idea that if you were hanged for murder, considered the worst crime,
Hmm.
you got a further punishment.
Yeah.
So, you could get hanged for a lot of things in the
Hmm.
mid 18th century, down to, minor things like pickpocketing or
Yeah.
poaching, stuff like that. That could get you the hangman's noose. But the idea was that if you were a murderer, you had to get something else,
Mm.
something that would be more of a deterrent than just getting hanged, which seems quite a lot of a deterrent to me. I really don't want to be hanged. Um, and so the Murder Act said that the judge could sentence the person who's being hanged to either be gibbeted.
Hmm.
So that meant that you were hung up in a cage to publicly decompose after you were hanged, or you could go to the anatomist's table. And so you would be dissected generally in front of an audience. Again, it was something that was meaning that your body wasn't going to be buried intact, which
Hmm.
for many people was believed that that was a necessity to rise come Judgment Day.
Yeah.
So this was not just ending your life, it was ending your chance of eternal life.
Hmm.
So this was what the Murder Act did, and this was the legal supply of bodies for anatomy school. So again, we've got to think that the Murder Act wasn't trying to help anatomists, it was trying to deter crime.
Hmm.
So, the helping of people studying anatomy was a kind of just a byproduct. But the trouble is, by the time we get to the 18th century, medicine has become much more focused. It's no longer about balancing the humors and those ideas that had been very, very popular up until recently. It becomes much more about actually looking at the body and what is causing disease in the
Mm.
body. So you've got to understand what's going on inside. So studying anatomy is very, very, very important.
Yeah.
And, to do that, you need dead bodies.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was really the only way you could do it. Even now, it's still the best way to study anatomy.
Mm.
So this was a legal supply. The trouble is, there's not enough people being hanged for murder. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, I've done research. My research is based in Scotland. Uh, Between 1752, the Murder Act coming into force, 1832 it ending, there were less than 100 people hanged for murder in Scotland.
Really? Crumbs.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Um, There are several medical schools. There's the one here in Edinburgh, there's the one in Glasgow. From the 1780s, you have one in Aberdeen. Uh, Edinburgh is the place to study medicine in Europe.
Hmm.
In the 1780s, there are more than 400 students per year.
Wow.
And you think about 100, less than 100 bodies over an 80-year period for teaching that. And so the shortfall is made up by the resurrection men.
Hmm.
And you've got to think as well that, this is for the university medical schools. There are also a lot of private anatomy schools
Mm.
in many of these places. Edinburgh had, at least a dozen of them at a certain point in time. They don't even have, recourse to the legal method of getting the bodies. They've got to rely on the less legal methods.
Hmm. Well, one of the interesting things about that I was going to add in is mentioning about when someone was hanged for murder, they could either be gibbeted or um, dissected. Only men could be gibbeted. They would never they would never gibbet female murderers because there were
Mm.
so few women's bodies. That wasn't ever an option because they were so
Yeah.
desperate to have female anatomy. So, and I've never actually, I don't know if you've looked in your research of those 100 murderers you talked about, how many of them were women? Because I would guess it wasn't many,
There were a few, but not a
percentage
lot.
wise, not a lot.
Yeah,
And that
percentage-wise, it's
makes
tiny.
and that makes me wonder if why all the knowledge of human female anatomy for doctors was so poor. I mean, one of the other blogs I read was talking about it was an amazing he was a gynecologist who started working on removing ovaries and removing one of the tumors you would
Oh,
preserved.
yeah,
He
the
he
Variotomy by Thomas Keith.
yeah. And he would have been very much in the minority of being a doctor who was specializing in women's specific anatomy. And I do wonder if that's because there was so few female bodies for these doctors to work on. So those that did, well, they may not have had much experience, which is why the mortality rate for working on a live woman, was so poor. I mean, obviously, I know it was to do with infection and everything else, but I do wonder how much of the repercussion of there being less female bodies to work on had on female medical help going
Yeah, I mean,
forward.
it's a really interesting thing, that kind of medical sexism that
Mm,
has gone on over the years. But yeah, there was certainly, in terms of the legal supply of bodies, far fewer female bodies for people to
mm,
work on. I mean, if you look at the victims of William Burke and William Hare, there were a number of women there. So,
mm,
there were people who were certainly getting access to that. But I mean, when you look at the high mortality amongst people who, like women who were attended in childbirth by male doctors rather than midwives, as was starting to happen, in the 18th and 19th century. There are a whole variety of reasons why, um, the doctors were not doing as well as many of those midwives were.
mm. I mean, one of the big things with childbirth was infection subsequently because they didn't believe in having, well, clean hands, let alone
Yes.
clean anything else. I can't remember, it was a while ago. I was reading a description of what they were doing and everything, and I'm kind of
Yeah.
surely just washing your hands would have stopped you cross-infecting one woman who you've just dealt with, because childbirth ain't clean.
It's
There's a
not.
lot
And
of guts. There's a lot of blood and guts
there's
going on there.
And there's a doctor who's based in Vienna called Ignaz Semmelweis who had noticed there the difference between mortality between a ward that was attended purely by midwives
Mm,
and a ward that was attended by doctors.
mm,
And he was trying to figure out the difference between it. This was in the 1840s, so before we get Lister and his theories of antisepsis. And um, he tried loads of things trying to find out what it was between the two wards that was different. And it's the breakthrough for him came when one of his colleagues who'd cut his finger while doing a post-mortem examination dies of something that looks really, really similar to the puerperal fever that was
mm.
killing so many of the women after they gave birth. And he
Right,
was just like, well, the symptoms are the same. This must be the same thing. And so
right,
he theorizes that there is something, he calls it cadaveric particles,
right.
that's coming from the dead body and being transferred first to his friend and then to the women. Because, like you say, they were going straight from doing an autopsy to attending women in childbirth, which midwives were not doing the
Mm,
autopsies. Um, And so he actually puts in place a system of using chlorinated lime to
Okay.
clean your hands. Because you've got to think again at that point, we say it really flippantly, why didn't they wash their hands? But it's not like there's a sink
Mm,
in every room like there is in a hospital today. There's no running water in that way that you can just go and give your hands a quick rinse,
mm.
at that point. So they were using chlorinated lime to clean it, and the mortality rate drops. And so Semmelweis publishes on this,
Right.
saying this is the thing, it's this transfer of cadaveric particles which is causing this problem. And his ideas are not taken up. There's a man called Charles Meigs who writes in one of his textbooks going, but he did he carry it on his hands? But a gentleman's hands are clean. And
Okay.
it's the idea that, it can't possibly be our hands that are causing the problem here. And Semmelweis actually dies in an asylum because he's
Oh.
just like, but it's so obvious, and he feels so terrible that this isn't being recognized.
So that was almost, would you say that was almost a form of sexism, which it can't possibly be the man's fault?
Well, of course not.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I do I say it's all absolutely fascinating. But back to the Anatomy Act. So
Hmm.
there you can find loads of if anyone's interested, you can find loads of newspaper accounts about the resurrection the resurrectionists and the problems people were having with them. A lot of the main sites were where the main medical hospitals were, but that didn't mean that was exclusively where they were plying their trade and digging up bodies.
No.
There was a case that I spoke to somebody about recently, and it was a body that I think it was sent on the train from Southwest, like Bristol or something, to go to London. It was in a wooden box, not a coffin, an actual wooden box, and it was
Yeah.
actually so it doesn't have to just be graveyards in Edinburgh and graveyards in
No,
London.
no,
It can happen everywhere.
yeah, there's a wonderful book by a woman called Susie Lennox.
I've got it. I've got it.
You've got it, yeah. And she has gone through so many newspaper accounts bringing
Mm,
up these stories, like things like there's one that always sticks in my head, but it was a body that was coming to Edinburgh, but it had been put in a trunk on the mail coach from
hmm
Newcastle, but the coach was delayed,
hmm
and there's an unfortunate oozing coming out.
I've heard that one too. It was so don't
Yeah,
just think because if you were buried in anywhere but Edinburgh or London, you were safe. You were not. Hence
yeah.
all mort safes coming in.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing that, people, to bring bodies here, for example, would have gone to Greyfriars where there
Mm,
are moat safes. But again, people got wise to that. People started to have these additional, protections. They realized that it might happen. So people would watch, there were watch houses built so that you could keep an eye over your loved one's grave, a whole range of different protective methods to
mm,
stop people digging up the bodies. And that meant that if you were a resurrectionist, you had to be a bit more cunning and go to
mhm.
the places where you might not expect this to be happening.
hmm Oh, and just this is another one of my bugbears. When I see every year, I see the post. These mort safes were to stop people rising from the dead because
Oh,
they were
yeah.
vampires. Ah! No,
No,
I've
no, no,
I've had
no.
people. I've when I've corrected people on those history posts about that, I've had them tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. And it's just like, no, honest to God, they are nothing to do with
Yeah. You
vampires
you
or
send them to me,
witches.
I'll deal with them.
It drives me up the wall. I mean, you also had there's one actually still remaining. It's actually St. Paul's Church in London in Covent Garden. They've actually got a watch, like a watchtower, a watchman's room, and the watchman would
Mm,
have sat in there, would have been paid to sit in there to watch over the fresh graves until they were at the stage where they were past the stage where the resurrectionists would
yes.
actually want the bodies.
Yeah.
And it's quite amazing to think that people were actually having to go to these lengths to stop their loved one being I mean the whole process of how they dug them up and the technical side of it and what they would and
Yeah.
wouldn't do, it's actually quite fascinating. It is actually quite fascinating when say Susie's book is a great one to learn from. So to try and stop this, they decided that they had to, I'm putting this simplistically, they had to stop the stop the need for stop the ability of resurrectionists to get money for this, because if there was no money in it,
Yeah. There's
they
no money
wouldn't
in
do
it.
it.
Yeah, and I mean that was one of the things that people did it because they got well paid for it.
Mm.
So like you say, if people have another way of getting the bodies for dissection, well, yeah, you reduce that desire to pay so much for a body.
Mm.
So it's actually anatomists who are really starting to drive this. They're trying to get this done from, like the early 1820s. There are discussions around this. And a lot of it is kind of financial, because you've got to pay so much for the body.
Hmm.
Um, you then get, the Napoleonic Wars come to an end,
Mm.
travel in Europe becomes safer. Um, Universities in Europe were often getting unclaimed bodies
Hmm.
for dissection. So that means that, you didn't have to pay as much for your anatomical education if you went to Paris.
Hmm.
And the Napoleonic Wars ends, it becomes safe to go to Paris. And then once you finish, you can carry on and do your grand tour. So that starts to become more attractive than paying a ridiculous amount of money to have to study it in London, where they have to pay, £8 to £12 a body
Mm.
uh, uh, for you to do a dissection. So the anatomists are kind of thinking, surely we can lower our costs if we do this. So there starts to be a bit of a campaign sort of develops,
Hmm.
and it goes to Parliament. There's a parliamentary committee in 1828. It goes to Parliament early 1829, and it doesn't pass. This idea of an Anatomy Act, which would allow anatomists to use, like they do in Europe, unclaimed bodies for
Yeah.
dissection, um, because there isn't an appetite for it. The people, it's not going to win you votes talking about dissecting the dead, that kind of thing. That nobody really wants to be talking about that. And that there's a whole array of dialogue about this. You can see there are petitions, lots of, by members of the public who will actually write and say, we would like this so that, we don't have to worry about our loved ones being
Mm.
dissected. But, there is not the drive to pass it, so it doesn't go through Parliament.
Mm. But it did eventually.
But it does eventually.
Mm.
And Burke and Hare are actually one of the reasons why.
Hmm.
The fact that, and again, same time that this is going through Parliament, the first time they're carrying out their crimes.
Yeah.
They're carrying out their murders on the streets of Edinburgh. William Burke is hanged in January 1829,
Hmm.
and it's big news. You
Hmm.
know, this is absolutely huge. And then it's not just that, you get copycats.
Hmm.
You get all these body snatchers, these resurrection men who suddenly go, hang on, we've been doing this really hard work for a long time.
The London Burkers, is that the
The
ones you're thinking
London
of? Yeah.
Burkers. So you get the London Burkers are men who had been resurrectionists
Yeah.
who turn their hand to a wee spot of murder.
Hmm.
And eventually in 1831, they're caught, convicted, and hanged.
Hmm.
Um, and again, William Burke, he's hanged under the Murder Act, so he is publicly
Oh, the
dissected.
irony. Oh, the
Yeah,
irony.
and his skeleton is still on display at Edinburgh University. It watched over me as I was doing my student tutorials back when I was an
Please,
undergrad.
please tell me you called him an arsehole once or twice.
I have actually been very, very up close and personal to William Burke because I got called in to do conservation work on his skeleton. What's that, 3 or 4 years ago now?
Right.
So I have been inside his head. I've had his arm around me. I have cleaned the insides of his rib cage. I have photographed every inch of his skeleton. I know him better than probably anyone. Um,
But did you call him an arsehole? I mean, let's face it, at the end of the day, he was a murderer.
he was a murderer, and that's a very strange feeling to have
Mm,
when you're so up close to someone.
yeah. So one of the main things from the Anatomy Act, it basically, and again, I'm simplifying it, so please excuse me. It basically said if you were an unclaimed body that died in a hospital, a prison, or a workhouse, and you weren't claimed within a set period of time,
Yeah, 48 hours.
48 hours, your body could be donated to a local registered, and that was the important thing,
Yeah.
registered anatomy school. Now, me with my 21st century head on, I can't see the problem because to me, if that's all being done ethically and my body's being used to help, I'm already dead, but
Yeah.
my body's going to be used to help someone else potentially live. Because I'm not religious, I don't see the problem.
Yeah.
If I
I
had
mean, I
been
think,
around in 1832, I'd have possibly not been the majority opinion on
yeah, I
that.
mean, I think that was one of the things that there was a view, and again, because this was something that was very, very quickly, because the Murder Act was ended,
Mm,
they were no longer using bodies from executed criminals, that was seen as taking punishment for murder
mm,
to punishment for being poor.
mm,
So there was very much, you know, I think even if you weren't religious, and so many people were at
mm.
that point, even if you weren't, there was that feeling of, well, it's just now it's us.
Yeah.
You know, I think there was that. There's also the fact that it is only 48 hours.
Mm,
Now, you think that if you're in London and you'd left family behind in, I don't know, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, somewhere
mm.
a bit further removed, and the workhouse has to write to your family to say that you have died, are they going to be able to claim you within 48 hours,
Probably not.
even if they
Mm,
have the ability to? You know, so there was that idea that maybe you've not got enough turnaround there to be
mm,
able to say this person is truly unclaimed.
mm,
Um, so, you know, there were a lot of problems that was very, very much became seen as being punishment for being poor. And there were
mm,
riots. You know,
mm,
there were a number of places where, you know, certainly in Cambridge, where there were riots that led to, you know, destruction in anatomy schools where people were trying to protest that this was happening.
mm. The thing is, though, because my sort of one of my specialisms is the post that 1834 workhouse. There's a lot of
Mm.
people that lump all of that in together. Now, technically speaking, this was before that. This was when it was still the parish workhouses, which really genuinely had no rules. They could be
Yeah,
run almost. I mean, they technically had some rules, but not like the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act put in. And there were cases of, as you say, people not being, or their relatives not even being notified that their loved one
mm,
had died. The parish workhouse master making money off it, which they technically weren't supposed to. It was supposed to go
yeah,
back into the workhouse fund. Any money that was given, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but any money that was given to them for a body was meant to go back into the workhouse fund to
yeah,
supplement the rest of the inmates of the workhouse. Um, when the 1834 Act came in, they stipulated this even more, that you could not, you know, the master could not get rich off their dead. But there was actually it was one of the London masters, and I can't remember which parish he was part of. And this was about 18, when did I find it? 1840 something, 1841, I think. He actually made an official complaint because he said that bodies were being kept for longer than the period that they were supposed to be kept on the dissection table, and they were
mm.
becoming so decomposed. He was getting back, where is it here? There was a certain period of time they were supposed to be able to keep a body, and I was thinking, without any attempts of refrigeration or whatever, that it would have been pretty stinky by the
It
end of
was,
six or
yeah.
seven
I mean,
weeks.
yeah, absolutely. Once you're starting to get, you know, I mean, anatomy was largely a winter sport before you start getting into these
Right.
kind of, you know, methods of refrigeration,
Hmm.
and commonly being embalmed. You know, obviously now most bodies that are donated will have some form of embalming going on to allow them to be used over a period of time. In this period, you know, a post-anatomy act, you were getting some attempts, but it wasn't as commonplace.
Mm. And
Um,
his complaint was the bodies he was getting back were literally just a few bones because everything
yeah,
else had, and he said that's really disrespectful to, you know, the body that you've been given. And he actually refused to release any more bodies to the anatomy schools
yeah,
because he said they were so disrespectful to the bodies. And I quite like that because everyone thinks it's the workhouses that were the villains of the piece. And some of the research I've done just for this show, actually some of the workhouses were sticking up for the poor and saying, look, I know, and these were the genuine ones who did put the money back into the workhouse, who did, they weren't, but then there were others that were, there was one case I found, I think it was in one of Peter Higginbotham's books on workhouses. It was, again, it was a London one who was being paid quite a lot, and he was almost acting as a resurrectionist. He was actually pretending he was going to bury the body,
Mm.
and the family were there, but then they were actually burying an empty coffin because he'd already
Yeah,
taken
with
the
some
body out and
stones in or
sold it.
something like
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah. So it
yeah.
works. It works both ways. But
Yeah,
I mean,
and there was, and I've completely forgotten what his name was. There was a gentleman because you could opt out,
mm,
but the problem was that so few of the people who were in, in workhouses and prisons had that degree of literacy. There
mm,
was a man who was going and helping, people who didn't want this to happen to them in
yeah,
case, to be able to go and, have some sort of document to say, no, actually, I don't want this to happen to me.
mm.
So there were people who were trying to help.
But the if I could say the benefit of your body being used, I mean, apart from the benefit to medical students and medicine in general, was one of the things was that the anatomy school had to pay for you to have a proper funeral. They had to pay for your body to be buried. And that was a big expense for workhouses and prisons when there was no family to pay the bill.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
to me, there was, I suppose, the plus to it
Yeah.
because that rule was in place.
Yeah. I mean, there was, I feel like there was some degree of quid pro quo,
Mm,
that there is something, but it was certainly exploited at
mm.
times,
As is everything.
as is everything. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
But, our medicine has definitely benefited from those gifts of the bodies, whether or
Mm,
not they were willingly given. There was certainly a benefit. Now, the ethics of it are incredibly dubious,
mm.
but we all of us have had some benefit of what
Yeah.
went on today. We are all complicit in that crime.
Yeah.
If you consider it, that the lack of ethics in that way.
Mm. But I say I can actually I can see the say the lack of ethics in it. But as with everything, it's like when people criticize the workhouse movement, the Victorian workhouse movement, and I sort of try and point out that a lot of those people in there would have died if it wasn't for that
Yeah,
element of welfare. No, it wasn't run brilliantly in some places. And would I have wanted to be in a workhouse in Liverpool or Manchester or something like that? Hell no, because it was horrible. But then again, there's an awful lot of things that are horrible now that you wouldn't want to have to
yeah,
deal with, and they're there for a reason. So,
yeah,
um, I mean, you mentioned the lime that they were using to clean their hands with. The chap
yeah.
you were mentioning about the childbirth thing. I had a bit of a conversation with someone recently who was slating asylums from the 19th century, saying, "Oh, it's all for they used to just tie people up." I was like, "Well, why
Hmm.
do you think they tied them up? Why do you think they restrained them?" Well, because it made their life easier. I said, partly. I said, well, they didn't have sedatives. If you've got someone who's violent, they're going to hurt themselves, hurt you, hurt the other patients. So you restrain them so that at least people are safe. Because what's a sedative? It's a chemical restraint, and it's
Yeah.
looking at it in a probably a bit of a provocative way because I always get given called rude words when I say things like this. But I just like to look at both sides of it. That yes, I can see the bad, but I can also actually see what the people who were trying their best were trying to achieve.
Yeah, there's
Which,
certainly a rationale behind it. Whether
mm,
or not we agree with that today,
yeah,
it's effectively a different question in a lot of ways.
go on. In what way?
Well, I mean, I think, like it's that sort of thing of how you judge past actions with, modern standards. And it's a very, very slippery tightrope,
Yeah,
that of trying to kind of, it's making things black and white when there are, 80 gazillion shades of grey in between.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the reason I state the other side is because so many people only see one side, and I'm saying, well, if you look at this as well
Yeah.
and then decide, have both complete the black and whites and then see what shade of grey you're going to choose,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
it does. Yeah.
Good. Well, I mean, God, we're rattling on here. One thing I don't understand though, going back to Burke and Hare, is why have you got a skin book at the museum?
Well, this was often thought of as a further punishment. We're not the only place that has a book bound in human skin from a criminal. So it was one of those things that would be, it would be considered another act of punishment, further
Yeah.
humiliation.
Okay.
Um, that you would, that you would be able to do that. Plus, there were people who wanted mementos, that kind of trophy hunting kind of mentality.
Mm,
Um, so that sort of thing did go on. I
mm.
mean, in Bury St Edmunds at Moyse Hall Museum, there's a book bound in the skin of William Corder, who
Is
was the
there?
Red Barn murderer. Yeah. In fact,
Ooh.
they recently they've had one on display for some time, and they recently found in a store another book bound in his skin. But
Wow.
that binds an account of his crimes.
Wow. Okay. So how hard is it to preserve that?
I mean, it's basically like leather.
Okay.
It's been tanned in the same way that you would any animal skin. We're not that different.
Mm.
So it's effectively the same museum care that you would give to an ordinary, I say that in inverted commas, an ordinary leather-bound book.
Right. Wow. Well, changing the subject somewhat, one of the questions I put down is, and let me find my question that I wrote down because it was, how does the museum that you work at, what can historians and medical students, what do they learn from it? So is it still almost like a medical school in the artifacts that you preserve? And if so, how? What do they learn from it?
Okay, this is a really, really interesting question because when you think, I talked about how essential human remains are to teaching medicine in the 19th century.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to the 1960s, this kind of archive of the human body that a museum like ours represents isn't actually as important to teaching medicine as it was in the 19th century. You've got a
Right.
whole range of other things that have came in, ways that you can look at the body. And I mean, today there are so many different things that you can do. So this kind of, actually having the thing preserved so that you can talk about it, so that you can show another doctor, have you seen a case like this before?
Mm,
That becomes less important when you can take a picture of it,
mm,
and kind of and then show the doctor and say, have you seen a case like this before? You
right.
know, there are things that start to come in that make these kind of medical collections less relevant to medical teaching.
Hmm.
So that's about the 1960s. And so this is a point when a lot of collections like this kind of fall slightly by the wayside. They're less used, they become slightly orphaned. And again, at that point, you start to get some people getting rid of things. You
Hmm.
start to get neglect, which when I was taken on to the Hunterian Museum, when I started there 25 years ago, it was largely a neglected collection at that point. These 18th century anatomical preparations that nobody had really looked at for a while, and certainly not given any care. So that's a problem. That's one of the things about having human remains is that you absolutely should respect them as
Yeah.
human remains. You
Yeah,
should give in
definitely.
them that kind of care. So today, they're actually serving a very different purpose, really. And there are things which are important, like we're a very public museum. We get somewhere in the region of 120,000 visitors a year.
Hmm.
So that's a lot of people coming to see the remains that we have on display. And one of the things that you find is that people often make very personal connections. You
Mm.
know, we get people going around our pathology gallery trying to recognize something that they have or something their mum had
Hmm.
or their gran had, that kind of trying to understand it. And I actually it was really, really moving. In the middle of last year, I recorded a video with a woman who had came to our museum just after she'd been diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And she talks so well about how, you know, how that made her feel like, understood what was wrong with her, but also
Mm.
made her feel less alone,
Oh, wow.
in her diagnosis. I absolutely would recommend watching that video because it's so, it, I was there talking to her and it makes me cry watching it.
Where can we
Um,
watch it? Where can we watch
it's
it,
on
Kat?
it's on Surgeon's Whole YouTube channel.
Okay, brilliant.
So, so that kind of self-recognition is really, really important. It's also, today we're at a point where um, we don't deal with death very well as a society.
Mm.
You know, most people haven't seen a dead body.
Hmm.
You know, um, that kind of thing is kept very, very far removed. And I don't think, as a society, different people have different experiences, but largely as a society, we don't cope well with death.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that museums like ours, where you actually get to see the human body, it's a safe place to try and come to terms with those ideas of mortality.
Hmm.
And I think that's very, very important. It's also the fact that for a lot of people, we don't know a lot about that kind of space inside of us. It's really, really important to who we are, but
Mm.
it's quite a mystery. So again, this thing that you can actually see, which you hopefully don't see inside your own body when you're alive. That's generally not a good day, but this is a place where you can kind of get to understand what it's like inside you. So, there's a whole range of things like that. But there's also really, really important medical reasons why collections like this are really, really important. And this is something that I am doing more and more these days because we get people who can do things that are far cleverer than I can do, where they can look at the genetics in the tissue that we have. But largely, from our point of view, they're not looking at the genetics of the person, but of the pathogens that they carry.
Like the BRCA1 gene and all that kind of thing.
Exactly. The
Right.
genes, well, no, that's wrong. That's because they're people's genes. We're talking about the bacterial genes or the
Oh,
virus
oh, okay.
gene.
Okay.
So that allows us to look at the evolution of that pathogen.
Oh, wow.
So you can see what flu was like 150 years ago, what flu was like at times when there were, pandemics of
Hmm.
deadly flu. Why is that different to the flu that gives you a sniffle?
Mm.
Oh, makes you feel a bit crap for a few days. What is it? How does that flu evolve? And of course, we had that wee thing a couple of years ago where we all stayed at home for a while. And there was a lot of point at that where they talked about the way COVID was going to evolve, the way COVID might evolve. And if we understand about how other pathogens have evolved, that might allow us to understand how pandemics might arise, how they might
Oh,
might
okay.
occur in the future. So,
Okay.
these kind of things which really might make a difference to medicine today that you can find in collections like ours.
Wow. I'd never thought of that. Never
Yeah.
thought of that. That's fascinating. I mean,
Yeah, and we also have a sort of repository, things like tuberculosis, syphilis. I'm writing about gonorrhea at the moment because
right.
that's what you do. Um,
Yes. Pick a
diseases that,
subject. Pick a
yeah,
subject. Yeah.
diseases that haven't been particularly common for a
Yeah.
while in the developed world, in the Western world, but are making a comeback because of antibiotic resistance.
Mm.
So again, ways that we can use these collections to understand diseases that doctors might not have seen for a while.
Interesting. I mean, one of the one of the first things I read when you said you'd be happy to be interviewed was the blog you wrote on the tetanus painting, for
Yes.
example. And I was absolutely fascinated by that. Like I mean, it's one of the I love history and I love studying it and I love researching it, but I'm one of those people really struggle with using paintings as a learning I still do. I'm anti-art, what can I say? But I found that absolutely fascinating. It's like when you were saying that you couldn't do a painting of something because back in, no photos, no nothing. And it just so happened that Charles Bell was an incredibly talented artist, as well as
Hmm.
being a physician.
He was a
And
surgeon, not a physician.
oh, it was
He was
surgeon, sorry.
yeah.
And he was able to, and I know that the painting that's in the blog, it was an amalgam of four or five different soldiers. Like what?
Three different people.
Okay,
Yeah.
but
And
it was.
he had done sketches as he'd been working,
Mm,
just very quick sketches, and then afterwards, when things have calmed down a bit, he works them up into
Yeah.
these oil paintings. And we have a series that they're referred to as the Crimea oil paintings, which he did when he was dealing with the sick who were coming back from Crimea in 1809. And yeah, it's just such an amazing thing to see what those what those kind of what the surgeons who were dealing with those people were
Mm,
seeing,
mm.
what that looks like, what how tetanus affects the body, which is horrific.
It's a lot more
I
than
mean,
I thought it was just lockjaw. I always thought it was
yeah,
just lockjaw. I didn't realize
yeah,
it I mean, go. I'll share the blog on the Haunted History site so people can look at it and read it. But I'm pretty unfazed by stuff like this. I'm not saying I'm not sympathetic. I am, but I'm not squeamish. And
mm,
yes, I have been up close and personal with dead bodies. I am not squeamish at all. That
hmm.
painting, I did genuinely go, "Oh," when I saw it. It made me I I can't tell you the emotions I felt when I thought that's actually a depiction of what, all right, three people, but what someone was going through. And I learned a lot just from reading your blog on that. I learned a lot, which I was, so the thing I'm trying to point out is the museum isn't just bits of dead bodies, is it?
It's
It,
not, no, it's a we're trying to tell a story
mm,
of how surgery's developed, and human remains are a very, very big part of that.
hmm
I mean, one of the fascinating things about Charles Bell's paintings, because the tetanus, the technical term for that stage of tetanus is opisthotonos,
I'm glad
and
you pronounced it. I've got it written down, but I wasn't even going to try.
the Opisthotonos painting is probably the most famous of Bell's paintings. But we have some other of the paintings where we actually have remains that go alongside it.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's one where somebody has been shot in the arm and his arm's been amputated, and we have the bones of the arm with the injury following the amputation, which we have
Mm.
displayed next to the painting. And that is so powerful, that kind of
Mm.
being able to see both how that's affected his bone and read his account of what the way he put his fingers inside and he could feel the rough splinters of the bone, which showed that it was a comminuted fracture. So like a fracture where the bone is fragmented,
Mhm.
that he knew that was the case for amputation.
Mm.
And he amputates the arm, and there it is, that's the bone. That was part of that man. And
Mm.
it was, that was, that injury on a battlefield has caused him so many problems. And the way that that actually makes you feel is incredible.
Mm. No, it's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Well, that's an hour. I could talk to you for three times that, Cat. I really could. It's been absolutely fascinating. So I know I'm going to post the Surgeons Hall Museum website link on Haunted Histories. When can people come to the museum? What would you recommend they make sure they see when they come to the museum? And remind us again when your book, Conversations with the Dead, is going to be out.
Okay, so Surgeons Hall museums are open 7 days a week from 10 till 5. The only exception to that is over the Christmas period, which, people listening to now, that's not a problem. Um, so 10 to 5, 7 days a week. Please come along. There are so many things to see here. I could talk for another hour about things like that. But yes, have a wander around. There are fascinating things. You can see the book that's bound in Burke's skin. You can see things relating to Sherlock Holmes. You
Okay.
can see. Yeah, we have a letter, but there's an Edinburgh surgeon called Joseph Bell, no relation to Charles, who was one of Arthur Conan Doyle's teachers. And we have a letter that he wrote saying, "It is to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes because of the way that he looked at his patients." We have so many interesting cases that you can wander around, so many interesting people that you can meet in our museum and learn about, what happened in their lives and how they came to, end in our museum. So yeah,
Brilliant.
please
And the
come
book?
along.
And the book?
Yes, the book is going to be called Conversations with the Dead, and It's currently standing at about 60,000 words long. It's hopefully going to get a bit longer than that, and is due to be published in spring 2028. And if you want to find out more about that, my social media is at Anatomical Cat, and no doubt there will be lots more about that nearer the time.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I've
No, it's been a
genuinely
delight.
yeah, could have talked a lot longer on things like the Anatomy Act, but I wanted to touch on a few other things as well for people. But I'm hope we keep in touch because I'm looking forward to the book, and I agree with what you say. I think society, especially Western society, does struggle with the subject of death an awful lot. And I don't mean it as a throwaway comment, but if there wasn't death, there wouldn't be life. So you kind of have
Absolutely.
to have
I think we
the
wouldn't
two.
appreciate what we have with as much without it.
Exactly, exactly. Well, I'm sure you'll all agree, Kat, what an amazing, amazing guest that she was. If you do have any questions for her, please feel free to send them to me or go on to her site I can't even speak now, Anatomical Cat. Um, I have got more guests booked for the rest of this year because I'm trying to get you some good podcasts this year because I took my foot off the gas a bit last year. But if there is anything you'd like me to do, please do let me know. But on that note, that just leaves me to say good night. Have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.